Good morning. Welcome to this session, which is voter turnout, what works and what doesn't. My name is Karen McKim. I'm with the group called Wisconsin Election Integrity, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit citizens group that works on election administration issues. And when WGN said that I could do a whole track of workshops on voting rights, and they gave me complete freedom to pick whoever I wanted to come speak about issues related to voting rights, the first call I made was to the Election Research Center at UW-Madison and asking David Canon to be with us today. The research they've done on voter turnout I just find fascinating. You hear so much talk about voter turnout, from what people's opinions are and what they think works. And, well, it works for me, so it must work for everyone. That must increase voter turnout. But some of the research that really studies what different states have done and what the voter turnout response is just fascinating. So I wanted Dr. David Canon to be with us today. He's with the UW-Madison Political Science Department. Your degree is from Minnesota, and he was also a professor at Duke University. His areas of research interest include legislative elections, election administration, and of course voter turnout. So I'll stop talking now and let's get to the interesting stuff. David?
Great. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming this morning. When I saw the schedule this morning and saw that we were head-to-head, our panel with Jay Hecht and Matt Rothschild and Mike McCabe, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have like two people here. Like they're all going to be down the hall listening to the other speakers. But I'm glad that you came this morning. And yeah, so we'll talk today about voter turnout. And just to set the context a little bit, and this is something, here I'm preaching to the choir. I don't need to convince any of you about the importance of voting. But I think it is important to have the reminder sometimes about how each individual vote matters so much. Because I hear this from my students all the time of oh, why should I vote? My vote doesn't count. My vote doesn't matter. But you can look at the fact that two presidential elections in the last 16 years were determined by what amounted to one vote per precinct. So in the state of Florida, in 2000, one vote per precinct would have elected Al Gore instead of George Bush. It was that close. And this is, all the butterfly ballot stuff aside, he actually would have won just if one vote per precinct would have switched. And then in 2016 with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, a total of the margin in the three states combined of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the so-called blue wall that ended up going for Donald Trump, they're just under 78,000 votes had flipped. So again, just a handful of votes per precinct there would have flipped the election for Hillary Clinton. And so the closeness of our presidential elections even are such that individual votes really do matter. And then political science has done a lot of research too, just in terms of policy outcomes. And there's a vast literature that shows that voting matters in this other way of not just who ends up getting elected in close elections, but also in terms of policy outcomes, that politicians do pay attention to people who vote, and they don't pay as much attention to people who don't vote. And there's good evidence that supports that. And then finally, the basic premise of democracy is that as voters, we have to be able to hold our politicians accountable. And of course, voting turnout has a big impact on that. So I thought I would start with just the basic data on voter turnout, going back to the very first elections in our nation's history, all the way up until the most recent, the 2018 election. And you can see the blue line shows presidential elections, the orange line midterm elections. And you can see just in the last 30, 40 years or so, have about a 20-point gap between the presidential elections and midterm elections. So turnout's been averaging around 60%, between 55 and 60% of the voting eligible population in presidential elections, down more between 30 to 40% in midterm elections. And this is really low. If you compare it to any other Western democracy, we're substantially lower than other developed Western democracies. And most other Western democracies are in the 70 to 80% range in turnout. Now, 2018, on the other hand, turnout was nearly 50%. So be up to about there, a huge jump in for midterm elections. And so I think it shows that when there is a lot of voter interest in an election, you really can get people energized and get them to the polls. And so that midterm turnout in 2018 was the highest we'd seen in over 50 years. And so it really was a substantial jump in voter turnout. Now, on the other hand, so that I think is kind of good news. On the other hand, here's a kind of depressing map that shows that if did not vote was the actual, like, on the ballot. So in other words, if you look at the total votes cast for the winner and see, did that winner of the presidential vote in that given state have more votes than the number of people who didn't vote? This is what the map would look like. And so did not vote would have won 471 electoral votes. So in all of those tan states, there were more people who didn't vote than voted for the winner in that state. And you can see then the handful of states that actually had the plurality go to an actual candidate rather than not voting. So in Minnesota, Colorado, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, there Hillary Clinton actually got more votes than the people who didn't vote. And Wisconsin and Iowa were the only two states in the country where Donald Trump got more votes than the people who didn't vote, because we're relatively high turnout states. But that's a very stunning picture, I think, that shows, again, the overall importance of voting, that the fact that the non-voters are the biggest group of people in a presidential election even. So if you'd have the same map for midterms, well, there probably wouldn't be an election in the country where, well, no, take that back. There would be a few governors who had relatively lopsided wins, so there'd be a handful. But in midterm elections, this map would look even worse in terms of the non-voters being the decisive group of people. And so this, I think, is, if you needed any convincing that voter turnout is an important topic and that we need to do more as a democracy, I think, to get those people interested in voting, this map is pretty stunning evidence of that it's the non-voters who are actually bigger in number than the voters in terms of deciding elections. Okay, so just a little bit more kind of background before we get to the details of the kinds of things that affect voter turnout. This actually shocks some people when they hear this for the first time. I know my students all are, what? Is this true? But the fact that there's no affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution, like it's not in there. There are no words like saying any like affirmative right to vote. We have the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments that prevent discrimination based on race, gender, and age for 18 to 20-year-olds in the 26th Amendment. But even for voting for president, we don't have an affirmative right to vote for president unless our state legislature gives us that right. The Electoral College, the method for selecting the electors, the Electoral College, is done by the state legislature. Now, of course, since the very first elections, most states, there were a few early on that didn't do this, but since the very beginning, we've had most states do it by popular vote. And so whoever wins the popular vote in that state gets the electoral votes for the Electoral College from that state. But this is not something the Constitution guarantees. That's given to us by our state legislature. And so Mark Pocan, lately our U.S. representative, has been talking about trying to amend the Constitution to change that, to say that, look, we should have an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. Now, while the Constitution doesn't say anything directly about the affirmative right to vote, we do have the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was a really important piece of legislation for providing equal access to voting based on race. And so this is the law that really for the first time ended up giving minority voters in the South equal opportunity to vote, send in federal marshals to give them access to the voting booth. And we still have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that says that the right to vote may not be denied on the basis of race, and this is where you get a lot of the litigation today in federal court on things like voter ID laws, racial redistricting. These are typically brought as Section 2 claims under the Voting Rights Act. So that's still a really crucial part of the law. Section 5, on the other hand, which had been an even more powerful tool for many states that had been discriminatory based on race, that was basically taken off the books in 2013 in the Shelby versus Holder decision, where the Supreme Court struck down another part of the Voting Rights Act that gave the Section 5, which is the part of the law that basically said that any discriminatory practice could be stopped before it went into effect. So like moving a polling place out of area that served heavily minority voters, or changing district lines to make it harder for minority voters to elect a candidate of their choice. Those kinds of things could have been stopped before they happened under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now that that's gone, they can't be stopped ahead of time. You can only sue after the fact, after they've been in effect. So that's a powerful tool to protect voting rights that was done away with in that 2013 decision. There is an effort right now in the U.S. House to change that. That there's a bill, H.R. 2, that is right now they're building up the legislative record for to try to bring back that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And so we'll see if that gets the support it needs in the Senate. It definitely will pass the House, but it's going to need to get support in the Senate as well to become law. But there's a chance that could happen. And then finally, in the Voting Rights Act, you also had, in 1975, amendments added to protect language minorities. And so if you have substantial language minorities, they too would get protection under the Voting Rights Act. And so that's just a little bit in the way of background. Okay, so now more of the main things I wanted to talk about in terms of voting law and how it affects turnout. So these are the main things I'm going to talk about today, is election day registration, same-day registration, early voting, and voter ID laws. So election day registration is what we have in Wisconsin, where you, on election day, if you go to vote and you haven't been registered before, that you can register to vote right there at the polls. And there are about 8 states in the country that have that election day registration. And as I'll show, that's one of the best tools for enhancing and increasing voter turnout. Same-day registration is the same idea, but this is where you can also then register on the day that you vote when you have early voting. And so you can go vote early, like in your public library, and if you haven't registered to vote yet, you can register right there on the day that you vote as well. And so that's the same idea as election day registration, but it's happening before election day when it's combined with early voting. And then you have just early voting by itself, and that's just the idea that you can cast your ballot ahead of time without any excuse. It used to be, in most states, if you didn't vote on election day, you had to actually have a documented reason. You had to have some health condition. You had to show that you were out of state for business or something, and you'd have to give proof of this in order to be able to vote early. That now is changed in many states, and I'll show you in a minute the slide of the breakdown for different states. But in many states now, you have no excuse absentee voting, which you can just vote early before election day in that window of early voting. And then voter ID laws also tremendously vary by state in terms of what kind of identification is needed to vote, if any. So I'll talk about the impact of each of these. Now here's the combination of the different states. Here are the ones that just have early voting. Here are the ones that have just election day registration. These have early voting and election day registration. The ones in the middle are these 6 states, Iowa, North Dakota, Maine, Wisconsin, Montana, Wyoming, have the trifecta of all 3 of same-day registration, election day registration, and early voting. So that's kind of the sweet spot that we're in that group of 6 states that has what I would say the best voting practices. And then there are 6 more states in the intersection of same-day and early voting. And so you can see there's a lot of variation across the states, but that's the mix that we get. So given that variation across states, this presents the opportunity to study the effect of that these laws have on turnout, that we have that variation across the states, so we can see what does that different mix of voting practices in terms of the laws, what impacts does it have on turnout. So this question alone is one that really hadn't been asked that much, because it sort of seemed common sense to say, well, of course early voting should help turnout. Like, how could it not? This is making it easier for people to vote. And so you would think that just on its face, this is maybe a silly question. But actually, when you start looking at it, there's some arguments on the other side to say that some laws do a better job of stimulating new voters, and others really are just retaining voters that would have voted anyway. And so you have to look at the direct costs of voting in terms of making it harder for people to vote, like a voter ID law, but also then what impacts does it have on mobilization. And I'll talk in a few minutes about how early voting can affect that election day mobilization that's been a traditional part of get out the vote campaigns. And if you have a state that half the people have voted already, you're not going to get those same resources devoted to that election day mobilization. So the idea of one-stop shopping is one thing that we found is crucial, is having those practices of registration and early voting together. So when people go to vote and they haven't registered yet, they can actually register at the polls, either on the day they're voting early or on election day, like with election day registration. Because if you think about it, a lot of people are procrastinators. Like they don't think about the election until maybe a week before the election. And so if they would try to go vote early in a state that doesn't have the same day registration, and they get to the polls and they find that they can't vote early if they're not already registered, they are out of luck. They can't vote. And so in Wisconsin, we really have, again, the best practices where we can go to the polls and get registered right there where you vote. And so, yeah, question?
I know there's a movement to have a national day off for voting, and I was wondering if that was, we don't have it in our country, but
Right.
I wonder if there's any study of how that impacts voter turnout too when people have an election day holiday.
Yeah, so election day holidays do tend to have a positive effect on turnout, but not as much as election day registration. Because again, let's say you have, some states still have like a 30-day window where you have to be registered to vote 30 days before an election. And so you can imagine, like a lot of people, again, they're not paying attention to the election, and then they either try to vote early or vote on election day and realize, oh, I can't register at the polls, and they're just, again, out of luck. And so a national holiday doesn't help if you don't have a change in the registration laws to make it easier to register. So it's really the registration that is key. I mean, don't get me wrong, voting holiday would be great, and it would definitely help, but it doesn't help as much as election day registration. Yeah.
The other thing that same-day registration helps that hasn't been brought up is Secretary of State of Kansas, Kobach,
Yep.
who purged and learned to
Yes.
purge
Yep.
numerous
Yep.
names
Yes.
that had the same last name.
Yep.
The person would go to vote.
Yep.
He's always been registered.
Yep. And they're out of luck.
Purged.
Yep.
He can't vote.
Yep. Whereas here you can, yep, because you can register at the polls. Yeah, absolutely. And I will get to that too at the in terms of other concerns about voting. But that absolutely is another huge advantage of having same-day registration, election day registrations. You can take care of any problems like that come up and just say, okay, well here's my documentation to register and take care of the problem right there. Whereas if you live in a state like Kansas, again, you're out of luck because if you've been kicked off the rolls for a wrong reason, then you're just not going to be able to take care of that problem. So just a little bit more on this idea of costs and mobilization. And so you can think about sort of direct costs and indirect costs. So the direct costs are the costs imposed by the law itself. So like a voter ID. Okay, so there, obviously it's time consuming. You have to get that ID. In some cases, you might have to go get a birth certificate if you didn't have one. And so there's actual financial costs involved. Even if the ID itself might be free, the documents underlying that ID aren't free. And so there are those direct costs that are imposed by the law itself. And then there's also, though, the indirect cost. And this is the cost through mobilization. And this is the place where early voting actually can have a negative effect, whereas the election day registration doesn't. And so the election day registration lowers direct costs without raising indirect costs. And so that's why it's the best. Whereas early voting actually lowers direct costs as well, makes it easier for people to vote. If they can vote before election day, makes it more convenient. But it could raise the indirect costs of the demobilization effect on election day mobilization. So let's see what the evidence shows. So here's the basic scatter plot of the 50 states with early voting. The two lines are the regression lines showing the slope of the relationship between total turnout and early voting. So states that have high early voting over here has slightly lower total turnout. The dotted line shows what the effect would be if you include Washington and Oregon. They're the two states that have mail-in voting, and so they're a little unusual. They do all of their voting by mail, and so they're enough unusual that we did it two different ways, one that shows with Washington and Oregon, one without. And so the slope of the line is even slightly more negative when you take Washington and Oregon out of the equation. And so you can see that overall there is a somewhat negative relationship between early voting and the aggregate and total turnout, which is a little counterintuitive. So we wanted to sort this out a little bit more sort of concretely and look at the effects of all these different combinations. So remember that Venn diagram that had all the different states in each of the categories. So this breaks it down then by each of the categories of election day registration by itself, election day registration plus early voting, the trifecta of all three, where again Wisconsin's, we're in that good bar of almost a 10% increase in voter turnout by having all three of those. So that's the place, again, you want to be. But here, and this was the surprising finding that we had in the study, was you have early voting by itself, it actually decreases voter turnout. Now, if you go back to the Venn diagram, there weren't that many states in that category. I think there were like 5 states maybe that just had the early voting by itself. But if you are in that position, all you're doing is helping people vote who would have voted otherwise anyway, and you're decreasing the mobilization effect of election day mobilization of getting voters to the polls on election day. And so the kind of marginal voter who's sort of paying attention to elections, maybe not, isn't going to get that knock on the door, isn't going to get that phone call, isn't going to see as many ads aired on TV in the couple weeks leading up to the election, because candidates are going to pull their ads too. And think about it from the perspective of a campaign. If you've got these battleground states, in fact, I'll show you the scatter plot here. So this shows all of the ads run in the major media markets. In the battleground states, the one on the left is for early voting under 50% of the total vote. The ones on the right is over 50% early voting. So if you're a candidate running a presidential campaign and you've got 2 battleground states, one in which 60% of the people have already voted a week before the election, and another state where nobody has voted, no early voting, and you still have 100% of your voters that are up for grabs, where are you going to spend your money? Well, you're going to go to the state that everyone hasn't voted yet. If 60% of the people have voted, you can't reach them anymore a week before the election. And so that's what you see happens. You get this fall off in the number of ads being run in those battleground states where people have voted. So the effect then is on those marginal voters who are sort of paying attention to the election, not so much, and they're just not going to see as many ads. They're not going to see as much voter mobilization going on. So that's why you get this effect then in the states that have the early voting by itself of turnout actually being lower in those states because you lose that mobilizing effect of the election day. Now, again, the way to really stimulate turnout is by combining that early voting with the same-day registration, and then that's what you get the new voters to the polls that will actually get interested in the election, go vote early, and they can register while they're there. So that was kind of the surprising finding that we had then of our study. Now, my colleague Ken Mayer has also done some research on voter ID laws. And voter ID laws, here it's been a very partisan issue in the last about 10 years or so, where in almost all the states that have passed the more restrictive voter ID laws have been in Republican states. There, I think it was 1 or 2 exceptions. And this has been the effort anyway, as advertised, was to reduce voter fraud. But as we've found out from internal discussions, that it was actually an effort to reduce turnout in areas where Democrats would be more likely to vote. So the people who are affected most are the young, the elderly, the rural, and minority voters. And especially young voters, the minority voters are the ones that would often bear the biggest brunt of this. In Wisconsin, my colleague Ken Mayer estimated, he was involved in a federal court case on the voter ID law in Wisconsin, estimated there were about 300,000 eligible voters in Wisconsin who didn't have the required ID necessary to vote. And so now a lot of them obviously will get that ID, and it's hard to tease out exactly how many people would be affected. But one of the best studies of this was done by the GAO that looked at Kansas and Tennessee when they implemented the new law, and they estimated that turnout was down about 2 to 3% because of the voter ID law. And that's pretty consistent with some other studies that have been done as well. Although it is sometimes hard, like there was this one study that was done that was trying to show basically that voter ID laws weren't that significant on affecting minority turnout. But the problem was they only compared like the 2008 election to the 2004 election. And of course you have the Obama effect where African American turnout skyrocketed in 2008 because of Barack Obama. And so of course you can't say, well, well, the voter ID law had no effect because turnout went up. Well, yeah, it went up because of Barack Obama, not because the voter ID law was there. And so you have to be pretty careful to sort out that kind of thing. On campus at UW is a big issue because the way that the law was written in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin student IDs were not voter ID compliant because they didn't have the expiration date on them. You have to have an expiration date on the ID. So students had to go get a separate ID in order to be able to vote. And now I think they did a good job of publicizing this and making students aware of the fact that they had to get the ID. And so a lot of students did vote, especially in the 2018 midterms. Turnout was definitely up in a lot of the student precincts. And so I think the word has gotten out. They need to have the ID. Here, just showing the map of the country of the strictness of voter ID laws. The gray states don't have any required document. Minnesota and Illinois, two of our neighbors, are two of those states. The darkest green, Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Indiana, Kansas, and Wisconsin have the strictest voter ID laws in the country. And the lighter green have somewhat in between. And so you can see this is something that is getting to be more common around the country. This was pretty unheard of about 20 years ago. So this has all been happening mostly in the last 10 years or so of adding these voter ID laws, again, which does make it harder to vote for sure. Okay, then finally, I just wanted to make sure, I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions because this is a topic I know a lot of people have a lot of interest in. And so I did want to end, though, with talking about some other tools of voter suppression. The case was mentioned of Kansas, but Georgia is another good example of this from the governor's race just in the midterm in 2018, where they used many of these other tools of voter suppression as well, including the exact matching of voter registration lists. And so if you had the voter registration list compared to, say, the driver's license list, and you would have to have an exact match of those. And there were situations where, like, if a hyphen was missing, or just something, the computer would kick it out and it wouldn't match, you were taken off the voter rolls. And this several states were doing that, and Georgia was one of them. Voter caging is a process where they send out a postcard to an address to verify that you're still an active voter and that you still live there. And if you wouldn't return that postcard, they would take you off the list. Which, excuse me?
Isn't that what they're using in Wisconsin?
Some areas have done that. Yep. And
Can I add something here?
Sure.
The session at 1:15 today, the breakout session in this room at 1:15, is going to be Richard Rydecki from the Wisconsin Elections Commission. He's specifically going to speak to what happened with that problem with the postcards and
good. He'll have all the inside scoop on that.
And all sorts of stuff. So yeah.
Great.
So 1:15 here, you can get all the questions about registration.
Good. So this is just a kind of preview of some of those other topics that I'm not focusing on. I'm more on the election day registration, early voting, voter ID stuff. But there are these other big issues out there. Voter caging is one, and another one actually that my colleagues and I at the election research that is not so much a turnout question as it is, does your vote matter? Does your vote count? If you're put in a district that's packed or cracked, where you used to have a majority Democratic district that was cracked into two districts, and so the Republicans then would pick up two districts where there used to be one Democrat, one Republican. That happened to an extreme degree in our redistricting that happened in this last cycle, and why it was challenged and sent up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's another way that is not as much, again, directly voter suppression in terms of turnout, but it definitely is affecting the power of your vote, and is it really a meaningful vote then in terms of being represented? And so I think it's another important topic in this broader topic of kind of the power and effectiveness of our vote. And then felon disenfranchisement is another one that's gotten a lot of attention, especially with Florida. Recently, just in the November elections, did have a state constitutional amendment that passed overwhelmingly in the state to give voting rights back to 1.5 million ex-felons in the state of Florida. Now, I understand that the state legislature there just this last week was taking some steps to try to sort of mitigate the impact of that to some extent, to make it harder to get your full voting rights back. Like, for example, you'd have to pay all of the fines associated with your criminal conviction before you'd be allowed to register to vote. Something that the amendment that was passed by the voters didn't say anything about that. And so this is not clear that's going to stand up or not, but that they are trying to mitigate the effect of that change in Florida. But this is something, again, around the country. There are millions of people who are permanently kept from voting because of a previous felony conviction that they have now gotten out of jail, they served their time, but they still can't vote. In Wisconsin, our situation is that if you have to be off papers, so you have to be both out of jail and then off parole as well. And so that's somewhere, it's not as strict as a state like Florida used to be, but it's also not quite as generous to ex-felons as some states are. But that's definitely has an impact on voter turnout as well. And then finally, the last thing, this has happened in Texas, some other states as well, where they made an effort to purge non-citizens from the rolls. And that, because in federal elections, you can't vote unless you're an American citizen. There are some states where in local elections they allow non-citizens to vote, but in most states you have to be a citizen to vote at all. And so it's certainly a reasonable thing to do to try to make sure your voter rolls are actually comprised of citizens. But the problem is in trying to actually do that, it's really difficult because they were using out-of-date records where there are hundreds of thousands of people that they had tried to take off the rolls that actually were citizens. And so again, this is another really pretty awful tool of voter suppression that's happening in some areas. We haven't seen that in Wisconsin at all, but that definitely is going on. So in 2018 in Georgia, a lot of this kind of came to a head. This was the race involving Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. Kemp was the Secretary of State at the time, so he was actually the person overseeing the election process. And so talk about a conflict of interest, right? I mean, this is the person running for governor is actually overseeing these voter purges. And so finally, after this got a lot of attention, including federal court stepping in and stopping some of the worst purges, over 500,000 people were removed from the rolls there. One election expert said it was the largest mass disenfranchisement in U.S. history. They had this exact match purge where 53,000 people were taken off the rolls. That was struck down by a federal judge because, again, they said a lot of those were just erroneous. Like they just had kicked people off of the rolls that shouldn't have been kicked off. 70% of the people in that exact match process were African-American voters. And so this was clearly being done in a way that would have helped Kemp get elected. But even with that court stopping that one part of the process, many of the other voters were actually taken off the rolls. And because, as was pointed out, in a state like Kansas or Georgia where you don't have election day registration, you can't fix the problem at the polls on the day of the election. And so we'll never know exactly how many voters were turned away because of that, but it was a really close race. And so there's a pretty good chance that Abrams lost because of those attempts at voter purges and suppressing the vote. And so that's just one example from the recent past of where this kind of tactic really did make a difference. So I'll stop there and just take your questions because I'm sure there are lots of things you all want to talk about. And again, I'm happy to talk about other things like partisan gerrymandering, and I may not know other topics, but I'll give it a shot. So yeah.
Yeah, I've been fighting ever since, I've been taking a stand on the voter ID law ever since the state passed it, and I did contact my state senator and state representative who are in favor of expanding voting rights, and I went as far as calling Governor Evers' office saying I'd like to see the voter ID law repealed, and I haven't heard back from him yet, and I was wondering how effective it would be if I wrote a letter to Scott Fitzgerald and Robin Voss asking them to repeal the voter ID law.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't hold your breath. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so it's a good idea to repeat the question, especially for the streaming, because they can't hear it as well. So the question had to do with the voter ID law, and he was saying he's been opposed to it from the beginning, has reached out to his very selected leaders, including Governor Evers, and just wondered if it could be useful at all to reach out to Robin Voss and Fitzgerald to let them know his opposition to the voter ID law and hoping it can be repealed. I think it's extremely unlikely that the Republican leadership would be open to changing that law because they see it as something that does sort of help their party. And this is an unfortunate sort of, I was going to say side effect, but it's more than that, but an unfortunate feature of the voting wars, as they've been called, is they do have this partisan element to them where one side wants to try to really make it harder to vote in some ways because they think they can gain from it, and the other side, wants to try to enhance access to voting because they think that'll improve their chances. And so you do get this partisan element that means I think it's extremely unlikely that the Republican leadership in Wisconsin would be open to the idea of changing the voter ID law.
What would your suggestion be about going about it, like for grassroots to ask for money to end voter suppression? Do you think that would help?
Yeah, no, I think that, right, no, I think the way to change it in a case like that is you do need to change the partisan leadership, because it's, the Republican Party right now, if that's the issue you care about, they're not going to change on the access to voting, and especially on voter ID laws.
And then do you think it would do any good if grassroots groups started a web page asking for money?
For sure, no, absolutely. And so just to give you...
Or posting something on change.org where I'd like to make that national.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to give you one good example of a grassroots campaign that was incredibly successful. So I was just at a conference about 3 weeks ago at the University of Maryland on partisan gerrymandering. So all researchers from all the different Big Ten campuses were there talking about partisan redistricting. And we had the woman who started the Michigan campaign come talk to us. We had different foundations and other funders of different grassroots efforts there, but she was there to tell us about her experience. This was a 24-year-old woman, had never been involved in politics at all. And after Donald Trump was elected, she's had a Facebook post that said, hey, who wants to help me do something about partisan gerrymandering? And the response was incredible. And within like a month, they had like 5,000 volunteers. They got the Michigan Constitution changed in 2 years to get the partisan gerrymandering taken out of the hands of the politicians and put in the hands of a nonpartisan commission. This woman, this 24-year-old woman who had never done anything in politics, was the spearhead of this effort to completely change the way that lines are redrawn in Michigan. So absolutely, that kind of grassroots campaign can clearly have an effect. So yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any studies that show how automatic voter registration affects voter turnout.
Yes, yeah. So the question is on voter registration, automatic voter registration, and how that affects turnout. And so these are comparative studies that have to do this, because there's no state in the country that has, the United States right now, North Dakota doesn't have voter registration. They're the only state that doesn't. But every other state has voter registration that's not automatic. But a lot of other countries do. And again, it's hard to sort out when you're doing cross-national studies, sort out all the other different electoral arrangements and cultural differences, and so it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the effect is of voter registration if it was automatic, but there's no doubt that it does have a positive effect. And we can see this just in looking at the range from the most restrictive voter registration laws we have, like those that have a 30-day window before the election are the most restrictive, up until states like Wisconsin that have election day registration. And you can see that impact of, again, almost 10% on the vote of the differences from the most restrictive to the least restrictive. If you get rid of voter registration, or make it automatic entirely, and so you don't have to even worry about it, then for sure that would increase the base of voters, because all those people who don't vote because they forgot to register, you take away that problem. And so I think that overall, nationally, I would guess that based on, again, the comparative research and looking at the state-to-state differences in the registration practices, that would probably boost turnout somewhere between 5 to 10% at least, I would say, nationally, if you'd be able to do that. Yeah.
I want you to speak a bit more about voting by mail,
Mm-hmm.
like Colorado, Washington, and
Yep, Oregon, yep.
How earlier do they have to register before they can participate in that? And it looked like that really bumped up the numbers.
It does, yep.
Do you see that as a trend, or where is that going?
Yeah, so I think there probably will be some more states that go that route, because it has worked well in the states that have done it, and it has increased voter turnout in those states. And so this is the kind of thing that usually changes fairly slowly, but I would guess that there will be more states adopting that. And again, just based on that scatter plot, you can see that those are several of the higher turnout states. And so that too has probably at least about a 5% to 10% impact on voter turnout if you'd go to the all mail voting, because it is just much more convenient for people to be able to do that. But again, it needs to be combined with registration that is fairly generous as well. That you need to be able to register to vote up until the time you request your ballot. And I think in both states it's like, you know, a week before the election or something, because you need to get the ballot, you know, sufficiently before the election, obviously, to be able to get it to on time to be counted.
Related side note to that, we were visiting a friend in Seattle, and he was reporting that the younger generation didn't know quite what a stamp was and how to use it. So they
Yeah.
figured out that they had to supply stamps when
Yeah.
they sent out the...
Right. And they do have these drop boxes too now. In Oregon and Washington, I know they have drop boxes where you can come drop the ballots without a stamp, even for those young people who don't know what stamps are. But that's a good point. And actually, so there is some comparative evidence that if you don't have those drop boxes, that actually the drop boxes are key for people, because it again makes it easier to drop off the ballot without having to go to the post office or find a mailbox, and so that can really help as well. But
Form of identification
Mhm.
for residency.
right,
Yeah.
right,
Right.
Is
Yep.
the biggest
Exactly.
confusion at the polls.
yep,
At
Yeah.
the polls, but we don't know how many people are staying away from the polls.
right.
Because they know they don't have the ID.
Well, so that's a really good question on like how many people stay away because they either don't have the ID they need or they don't think they have the ID they need. And this is another study that one of my colleagues, Ken Mayer, did, who's done the work on voter ID law. He did a survey that was actually supported by the county clerk here in Dane County of Dane County and Milwaukee County, where they did a survey trying to assess this question, like how many people didn't vote because they either didn't have the ID or thought they didn't have the proper ID. And what they found was that there was actually more confusion about that, where people did have an ID that would have been compliant, but they didn't think it was, and there was just, and so about as many people, and ended up being, they estimated, I think it was around 18 to 20,000 people or something in those two counties that either were confused enough that didn't vote because they thought they didn't have the ID necessary to vote, or actually didn't. And of course, this is based on a fairly small sample, and you're extrapolating to the broader population, so it's a fairly uncertain estimate. But definitely, they're in the thousands for sure of voters who are being deterred from voting because of confusion about the law. I think that's a really important point. One other point I want to mention about the actual process of registering that has changed too, that all of the poll workers in the rooms will know about this. And I've heard a lot of stories anecdotally again about this, but we don't have any good research on this yet. But the other thing that changed in the current law, in addition to the voter ID, was the fact that you could have someone vouch for you before at the poll to vouch that, yeah, that is Joe Smith. And I've known Joe all my life, and that would be a way that you could register that if you have someone vouching. And I've heard stories about like elderly couples that, again, the woman didn't have the ID. They've been married for 50 years, been voting at the same precinct for 40 years, and the husband couldn't vouch for the wife anymore if the papers weren't right. And so yeah, that's another one that we don't know for sure how many people that's affected, but there's no doubt that's affected some people. But one thing we do know is that the area that fraud happens is with absentees. That's where like 95% of the fraud happens with absentees, rather than like voter ID doesn't stop voter fraud. That the amount of, because all it can stop is voter impersonation fraud. And that like almost never happens. There have been study after study after study of this. And there was one meta-analysis that was done of like 40 different studies of this. And out of the literally hundreds of millions of votes cast, there are a handful of cases of voter impersonation fraud. And so that's not where fraud happens. And so voter ID laws really are ineffective at stopping voter fraud that does happen, which is more on the absentee ballots, where like in the North Carolina 9th District, we found out in the federal court case there that they actually were taking ballots that had been cast and destroying some of them if they thought they were not going to support their candidate. So yeah, no, this is, I think, a really important question. We don't know that much yet about the Oregon and Colorado and Washington, the mail-in problems, and how, like, if there are any votes that get lost in transmission there. and that's something that still needs more study for sure. But my sense is that it certainly is less secure than having election day voting. That is a much more secure process of actually knowing how many ballots are cast, how many ballots had to be. Every poll worker, if you have a destroyed ballot, like someone messes one up and they request a new one, you have to keep track of that. We have a count of how many ballots are there of that nature. So there's much better accountability on election day, I think, than there is with the mail-in process in general. So yeah.
How much confidence can we have in these old voting machines?
Yeah, so the good question. So the question is the confidence in old voting machines. How much confidence can we have? So there have been a lot of studies of this as well on voting technology. What are the best systems for the lowest voter error rate? And so the biggest problem in voting technology is the voter errors, that there's anywhere from at the low end, about 0.5% to the high end, about 5% of votes that are cast, given different voting technologies, are invalid because the voters mess up. And if you have ever looked at vote audits, you are amazed at what some people will put on a ballot. But the best technology, and this is been pretty consistent across various studies, is the paper ballot optical scan system that we have in most of the precincts in Wisconsin. Where you fill out either connect the arrows with a felt tip pen, or there are other ways, but to actually record your choice, but you're recording it on a paper ballot that then is machine read to the optical scanner. That is the best because it both has that permanent paper record of the vote itself. So if there is a recount, you can do the manual recount and be able to see the ballot itself. And this is crucial, if there's an error with the ballot, when you feed it in, it'll kick it back out and say, oops, sorry, you messed up, this can't be read. And so you can correct it, you can go get a new ballot, fix it, resubmit it, destroy the old one, and record that. And so it really reduces the voter error rate by having that kind of two-step process in place of filling out the ballot and then scanning it. So the worst probably in terms of overall, well, the really bad ones we've gotten rid of, like the old punch card butterfly ballot thing that gave us the Florida mess in 2000. Those are gone now. The Help America Vote Act basically got rid of that voting technology. Some of the old lever machines they used to have, like anyone who was from Pennsylvania, New York, Indiana, where I grew up, that had them, those things were terrible too. North Carolina, they always broke down. They were always breaking. And so you'd have half the machines on election day wouldn't work. And so you get these long lines, and so those were terrible. So those are mostly gone. I think there are a few states maybe that still use some of those old lever machines, but those were pretty bad too. But then the other one to be concerned about, I think, and this goes more to the voting technology, IT side of things, but are the electronic DRE machines without a paper trail. So the best ones now do have the paper record as well. You can see who you voted for on paper as it's recorded in the machine. There's still some states that are using the old electronic voting machines though without a paper trail. And those are the ones that are really potentially problematic, because if something, either there's hackers that get into the machine and steal votes, which we haven't had evidence that has happened in an election, but we definitely know it's relatively easy to do. But there's no way to uncover that then, because you don't have the paper record to be able to go back and see what the vote actually was. Those are slowly being phased out. There are not that many states that still use those. So I would say that's the big one now to avoid, whereas again, the paper ballot with the optical scan is the best technology for the both lowest voter error rate and the least potential for fraud. Yeah. So.
Is there anything we should be concerned about as far as the government accountability board here in Wisconsin?
Well, yeah. So the Government Accountability Board. We were talking before that our Election Research Center actually had a pretty close relationship with Kevin Kennedy. Did a lot of work for them, did a big survey for them, and really, the Government Accountability Board, the way it was previously constituted, was like the model for how election administration should be done in the country, and it was cited as such, by all the reports have been done of this. And it is unfortunate the way that was changed and kind of politicized, because it really was a model. So I would say the current arrangement now is is closer to like the average of other states, where it's not as bad as, say, Georgia, where you could have like the state election official running for governor and overseeing these voter purges. I mean, we're not there, but we're also not as good as it used to be. So somewhere we're sort of about the median, I would say. Good. All right. Well, thank you. Yeah.
We
Good.
really appreciate
All right,
it.
great. Oh, thank you. Thank you.